And it's not like a light bulb went off and I said, oh my God, they're innocent. But something didn't seem right. And so I remember calling Sheila Nevins, who, again, to her credit, she's an amazing catalyst for what documentary has become, but she also likes, salacious subject matter. And she had sent us down to make a film about teen satanic killers. So I remember picking up the phone, calling her to let her know that I'm not sure these guys are guilty, and I'm not sure the film is what you think it's going to be. A little trepidatious that she was going to cancel the project. But I felt I had to tell her. We're like 4 months in, and we've gathered enough information that these kids seem like they're the wrong guys who'd been picked up. I also created this incredible moral ambiguity because we had convinced the parents of the victims that we were here to tell their story, and they were utterly convinced of their guilt. But I called Sheila, and to her credit, she said, oh, that sounds even more interesting. Stick with it, because she couldn't have pulled the plug, and it's the number one lesson. I mean, I'm not sure if there are filmmakers in your audience or whatever, but my number one lesson that I tell people about filmmaking is never, particularly in documentary, never lock into the preconceived idea of what you think your film is about, because you'll miss the story. If we had locked into teen Satan killers and hadn't opened our eyes to the real story, we might have missed the story. But I never imagined that it would actually ever get to trial, because I had faith in the justice system. I never imagined that evidence such as Metallica lyrics or Stephen King novels would be presented in a court of law in the United States of America as the main evidence, and that somebody could be convicted on literally no forensic evidence, no blood at the crime scene. I mean, you know the details of this case. And so...
Well, yeah, but it's worth refreshing that.
When we're at the police station... the only thing, every so often, one of the cops would come in and say, are you ready to make your confession yet? I would just stand there and look at them. They would leave. I stood there all night long until the next day. They got me and took me into a courtroom. They tell me, somebody's already confessed to this crime. They've implicated you. They're saying you were the ringleader of this. So now what you need to do is confess to this and say, no, you weren't the ringleader. They were. Try to put the blame back on them, or you're going to die because of this. I can't even figure out who the hell they're talking about, because I've only got one friend in the entire world, and that was Jason Baldwin. I knew it wasn't him because he was with me, and I knew he didn't do it. I knew he wasn't going to confess to something he hadn't done. So I didn't realize who it even was that had confessed until the next day whenever they take me into the courtroom. They say who it is, and they ask, how do you plead, all this sort of thing. They refused to even read the confession in the courtroom. They asked me, did I want it read? I said yes, and they wouldn't read it even after they asked me, and I said yes. Instead, they take me out of the courtroom into a janitor's closet with mops and brooms. They give me a transcript, a typed transcript of this confession. When I started reading it, it's immediately obvious why they didn't want this thing read in court. It made no sense whatsoever. You're talking about this story that's like a Frankenstein patchwork thing that they've sewed together out of many statements made by somebody with an IQ of between 70 and 72. And what they would do is when he would confess to something and wouldn't get anything right, they would come back into the room and say, well, do you think maybe this could have happened? Or even more blatantly obvious, the first time they asked him, when did the murders happen? And he says something like 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, they knew that wasn't true because all 3 of the kids were in school. So gradually what they did was shape this thing to make it what they wanted it to be. That's why they didn't want it read in court.
No, and they ignored obvious signs that pointed to at least one, arguably up to 3 other individuals.
Yes.
Including, there was a local restaurant. Was it a Bojangles or something?
Yes, that's what it was.
It was a Bojangles where the manager called the cops that night and said there was a guy covered in mud and blood that stumbled into the fast food place and went into the bathroom. And to their credit, the manager called up and a police officer came but didn't investigate. And they ultimately collected evidence from that bathroom that he went into, which there was blood all over the place and mud, and they lost it.
Yes.
And there again were obvious signs. I mean, the one I just talked about, the various signs pointing to the stepfather of one of the boys. I mean, this one kind of came with instructions. Mm-hmm. And I know that it's difficult. I'm not an anarchist. I believe we do need a system of law and order. I think there are a lot of very good police and judges and prosecutors out there. But in this case, it's a small town, high-profile, complicated crime because the crime scene itself was a muddy riverbed, not the easiest place to collect evidence. It seemed to have been scrubbed to some degree, and then all the pressure. You ran into the perfect storm.
They put me in another cell where I would stay for almost the next year while I waited to go to trial. When we do go to trial, the evidence that they present against us is things like Stephen King books, the fact that we owned Metallica T-shirts and albums, posters that were hanging on our walls, things that were from like skateboarding magazines, ceremonial magic books. This is the evidence they had. The prosecutors tell the jury that these things are not only evidence that we're guilty, but they're evidence that I don't even have a soul.
I was totally surprised when I went to trial, and instead of the narration of the story revolving around evidence, the prosecutor, John Fogelman and Brent Davis, were saying things like the crime scene was completely clean. There was absolutely no evidence, no physical evidence left behind. And this, in fact, is evidence of satanic cult ritual activity.
Right, because the devil cleaned up the crime scene, basically. When they put that guy on the stand who was testifying as an expert on Satanism and witchcraft and all, and the defense attorney, quite rightly, said to him, where did you get certified at this? And it turned out he had spent like an hour doing some online something or whatever. It was ridiculous. It was laughable, right? The fact that he was calling himself an expert was laughable. And that's one thing that I was like, well, the jury's got to hear that. And the other thing was when they had the doctor on the stand, right? It was like an orthopedic surgeon or something, and they were asking him about the way that the one boy had been mutilated, right? And he had the skin cut off his penis. I mean, it was really pretty disgusting even thinking about it now.
Which we found out later was animals had actually started eating their bodies in the water that they were submerged in. And so when the police pulled Jesse into the police station and they laid out the photos of the bodies, they had him make up a story for all the visible wounds. The cause and manner of the wounds were unknown. They didn't know that all these wounds were animal predation.
If you remember when the jury went out, what did you think was going to happen?
I sincerely believed that we would go home, they would find us not guilty, that they would be able to totally ignore all the flaming prejudicial stuff that the prosecution was bringing up about Satanism and everything, and look at the case for what it was and follow the evidence. And you're told all your life that the purpose of the judicial system is to find the truth, when really it's to get a conviction.
They came back in, they sentenced me to death 3 times. They sentenced me to die by lethal injection 3 times. They sentenced Jason to life in prison without parole. The other guy, they sentenced to life plus 40 years. They immediately take me from the courtroom to death row, where I would not see Jason again. I saw him maybe 12, 15 years later for maybe 20 to 30 seconds. They used to bring other prisoners in to clean the barracks, and he was one of the prisoners they brought in one day to clean death row. So he comes by my cell mopping and sweeping. That was the first contact I'd had with him in like 15 years by that point.
It's truly mind-boggling, the whole thing, even by our standards, being entrenched in this work, and you hear one fucked up story after another, but this one
just takes the cake and
go, I talk a lot about the idea that when we willfully or accidentally, want to call it mistakenly, prosecute the wrong person and convict them, by definition, we stop looking for the right person.
Exactly.
And in this case, it sure seems like the prosecutors must have known that these guys didn't do it. At some point, they realized that they had the wrong guys. Maybe it was around the time you did, maybe it was sooner, maybe it was later. But then you're left with, wait a minute, so whoever this sick fuck is that did this terrible, or whoever these people are that did this, they're amongst us.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I do believe that during the trial and through the conviction, the authorities felt they had the right guy. And the reason that's scary is because of the utter incompetence and the ability to fall victim to confirmation bias, to all sorts of problems within our system. I actually think that they felt they had the right people. What I find evil, the real evil in this case, because a lot of that initial false conviction I attribute to human error, which is scary, and in some ways scarier than a conspiracy. But it's the post-conviction period where it became quite clear, I think, to everybody involved that these guys were innocent. And for people to hang on to their jobs, for people to not question things, for the same judge, Judge Burnett, who presided over the original trial, to be the post-conviction appellate judge ruling whether he had reversible error in the original is absurd. And that's the way it was for over a decade on that case. So the real evil in this case is the post-conviction period where people cared more about their jobs. And you see that all the time. It's why there shouldn't be prosecutorial immunity and all sorts of other issues. But just getting back to my origin story, in covering this story, I didn't have the gene that I thought film could be used for social good until the final moments of Paradise Lost, which are the final moments of the trial, where, oh my God, they really have convicted this guy on no evidence. And you see in Paradise Lost, Damien being chained up and led off to death row. I mean, we were in the room with him as he was being chained off and led off to death row. And Jason was being led off to life without parole sentences, and they get escorted out of the room. And Bruce and I look at each other like, oh my God, I cannot believe what we just witnessed. And that's when we vowed to do everything we could. And when the gene or the light bulb went off in my head, where I realized that, yes, I'm sitting on all this footage that can help, and that film, I think, can be used for shining a light. And so I feel like I stumbled on to the criminal justice system as a place to place my focus, but seeing how easy it is for people to make mistakes, seeing how easy it is for somebody to be sent to death, this became my calling. When I saw that zero evidence and Stephen King novels and Metallica lyrics can put you on death row.
Right. I mean, well, if that's the case, I mean, when you add up all the Stephen King novels and all the Metallica records that would sold, that means there's tens of millions of serial killers out there that we should all be very scared of.
It's crazy. And, he did have an affinity for Aleister Crowley, and that was also introduced. But still, this is not forensic evidence. There was no blood at the crime scene, no forensic evidence. I mean, it's just, this is the worst case probably I've studied in all these years.
So your film ultimately led to an amazing outpouring of support from people all over the world, regular people, as well as people at the very top echelons of society. Johnny Depp, Eddie Vedder, Natalie Maines, Peter Jackson, amazing people who became not casually involved, but deeply involved. And there's no separating that from the fact that it was a direct result of your movie, which had to feel good. But then how did it feel when finally, 18 years later, these guys walked out of prison? And knowing the role that you played in that,
right? Well,
and a lot of people played roles in it.
Right, that's the thing. I mean, I hope this doesn't sound falsely humble. I'm very proud of the films, and I think the films definitely played a role. And I definitely think that we're the ones who said against all the other media, because every night there was a news report or story of these monstrous killers. It was so prejudicing everything. So we were truly the only media saying that they were innocent. I think the film attracted a lot of the attention, but it's the activism of tens of thousands of people and the well-known people that got them out of prison. But that feels good. I mean, it's rare in one's career, when you make documentaries, you hope to affect people in some way. When you're a storyteller in general, you want to affect people in some way, and to have that kind of tangible effect on the outcome of a case felt terrific. Although I will say it was also very bittersweet because, it took way too long. 18 and a half years. Actually, with some cases, that's on the low end of things, sadly. But still, it took so long. And the attempts to deny DNA testing and the fact that the same judge remained on the case during the whole post-conviction is just outrageous. And then the end result was the Alford plea, where, Damien was not well on death row, as we know. And, Jason had to really debate whether he wanted to take the deal because he wanted to keep fighting. And some evidence that Peter Jackson paid for was coming out and very helpful, which, of course, scared the prosecution, which is why they were even willing to do the Alford plea. Should we explain what the Alford plea is?
Yeah, let's talk about it. Go ahead. You.
Well, the Alford plea is basically where you stand up in court. In this case, Damien and Jason and Jesse acknowledged that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict, but you maintain your innocence. You state that I am innocent of these charges, but I believe the state has enough evidence that a conviction could occur, so I plead guilty in exchange for time served, is basically what happened. So the death sentence was vacated and turned into a first-degree murder charge, and he was sentenced to life served, which allowed him to go out of the prison, and the life without parole sentences were vacated and turned into, time served. That's, you can understand why somebody would accept that, especially if you're on death row. but it's so cowardly on the part of the state of Arkansas. Does anyone really believe that if the state of Arkansas had an abiding belief that these were teen child killers who sacrificed 8-year-olds to